When Jerry Garcia died in August 1995, the Grateful Dead ended. That matters, and it has to stay clear from the beginning. What came afterwards was never the Grateful Dead in the original sense. There was no replacing Jerry, no restoring the exact center of the band, no pretending the loss had not happened, but the story did not stop. Instead, what follows was one of the strangest and richest afterlives in American music, a sprawling network of reunion bands, side projects, tribute concerts, and new ensembles that kept the songs alive while openly acknowledging that the original band had ended. So this is not the story of the Grateful Dead after Jerry, as if the band simply continued unchanged. It is the story of the legacy after Jerry, how Bob, Phil, Mickey, Bill, and a widening circle of collaborators carried the music forward in different ways for more than 30 years. Some of these projects felt intimate and exploratory. Some felt like partial reunions. Some grew so large they became new institutions of their own. But all of them were trying to answer the same question. How do you keep the music alive after what some consider the heart of the band now was gone? But before we get started, this is the fourth video of my series documenting the Grateful Dead decade by decade. To check out the playlist of this series, click here. Now, let's begin. In the immediate years after Jerry's death, the dominant reality was grief, not reinvention. The surviving members did not immediately rush into one new official band. Instead, the first phase of the post-Jerry era was fragmented and personal. Bob Weir leaned more heavily into Rat Dog. Phil moved towards what would become Phil Lesh and Friends. Mickey and Bill kept pursuing their own musical roads as well. That first reaction is important because it shows how final Garcia's death felt inside the Dead world. The legacy survived first through separate streams, not one unified continuation. And that fragmentation was probably the most honest response possible. Rat Dog became a place where Bob Weir could reshape familiar songs around loose grooves and jazzier interplay. Phil Lesh's post-Jerry world often worked like a rotating collective, bringing different musicians into the Dead songbook and treating it as a living, flexible body of music. Even from the beginning, you can see the basic pattern of the entire post-Jerry era. No single replacement for the Grateful Dead, but multiple living branches growing out of the same tree. The first major attempt to bring several core members back together in a more openly Dead-like format came with the other ones in 1998. This was a huge turning point because it was the first time the surviving members more directly tested whether the songbook and concert traditions could function in a band that felt closer like a reunion than a side project. The name itself says a lot. It referenced the old Grateful Dead world, but also clearly signaled that this was not the Grateful Dead restored. And the other ones did not remain a one-off. The project returned in 2000 and again in 2002, which proved there was a real demand from the audience and from the musicians themselves for a larger format continuation of the Dead experience. By then, the question was no longer whether the music could survive Jerry. It was obvious that it could. The question was what form that survival would take and how close the surviving members wanted to get to the emotional territory of a Grateful Dead reunion without actually crossing that line. At the same time, the side project world never went away, and that matters because the post-Jerry story is not just reunion band after reunion band. It is also the story of an ecosystem building. Rat Dog, Phil Lesh and Friends, Mickey's rhythmic-centered projects, and Bill's various ventures all kept the music breathing in different ways. A Dead song might take on one shape in Rat Dog, another in Phil's world, and something else entirely in a larger reunion context. That ecosystem approach helped preserve the core truth of the Grateful Dead traditions. The songs were never supposed to be fixed museum pieces. Even without Jerry, the repertoire kept moving. Cassidy, Eyes of the World, Dark Star, the other one, and dozens of other songs kept changing hands and changing shape. In that sense, the post-Jerry years were not just about preservation. They were about proving the material itself was strong enough to keep evolving. Then in 2003, the reunion format stepped into a more direct name, The Dead. That shift matters. The surviving members were no longer just orbiting around in absence under the title, The Other Ones. They were now asserting themselves more openly as the living custodians of the Dead tradition while still stopping short of calling themselves the Grateful Dead. The Dead toured in 2003 and 2004, and this period is important because it proved that the surviving core could still function on a major scale. It also deepened the importance of players like Jeff, who had already become a crucial figure in Rat Dog and would go on to become one of the great connective threads of the entire post-Jerry world. Jeff would later appear in the other ones, The Dead, Furthur, and Dead & Company, making him one of the quiet constants of the whole Legacy era. One thing that makes the post-Jerry story feel especially alive is that the surviving members did not all move together in a single line. Mickey and Bill could break off into projects like Rhythm Devils, emphasizing percussion, global rhythm, and improvisation from a different angle. Bill would later form Billy and the Kids, another example of how the Dead legacy could keep moving through member-led projects without trying to recreate the original band wholesale. That matters because the legacy was not being carried by one institution, it was being carried by a whole family tree. Some branches were closer to the original band, others were more experimental or more personal, but all of them helped prove the same thing. After Jerry, the Stongs still had places to go. The next major chapter began in 2009 with Furthur, formed by Bob and Phil. Furthur mattered because it reunited two of the central surviving architects of the Dead sound in a sustained project after years of more fragmented activity. And unlike some of the earlier post-Jerry efforts, Furthur quickly developed a reputation for being musically strong, flexible, and also energized. Its lineup, including John, Jeff, Jay Lane, and Joe Russo, gave the music both reverence and fresh emotion. For many fans, Furthur was one of the clearest proofs yet that the legacy could feel vivid, not just nostalgic. It was not the Grateful Dead reborn, but it was a serious statement that the post-Jerry era could still produce a living, high-functioning, improvisational band. By the 2010s, something even bigger was happening. The Grateful Dead legacy was no longer resting only in the hands of surviving members. Bands like Joe Russo's Almost Dead, formed in 2013, showed that the Dead songbook had become a living tradition for musicians who had never been in the Grateful Dead at all. That is a major threshold in the history after Jerry. First, the question was whether the original members could carry the music, and by the 2010s, the answer had broadened. The music was now strong enough that the whole new scenes and generations could carry it as well. Then came one of the most symbolic moments in the whole post-Jerry timeline. Fare Thee Well in 2015, the 50th anniversary concerts featuring Bob, Phil, Bill, Mickey Hart, and joined by Trey, Bruce, and Jeff. Those shows mattered because they were framed as a milestone, a reunion, and a public acknowledgement of the full sweep of the Dead story. But even here, the distinction held. This was a celebration of the Grateful Dead's legacy, not a claim that the Grateful Dead had somehow been restored. After Fare Thee Well, the next huge chapter was Dead & Company, formed in 2015 by Bob, Mickey, Bill, along with John Mayer, O'Till, and Jeff. Dead & Company became the largest and most visible post-Jerry vehicle for the Dead catalog, and that matters historically because it took the music beyond nostalgia and into a new era of a mainstream scale. Dead & Company did several things at once. It gave Bob, Mickey, and Bill a major touring platform. It elevated John Mayer from a curious outsider to one of the most impactful interpreters of the Dead songbook in the modern era. It gave O'Till and Jeff even more central roles in carrying the emotional and musical DNA of the songbook. And it brought in large numbers of younger fans who had never seen Jerry Garcia, but now found their entry point into the music through this band. After years of touring, in 2023, Dead & Company announced the final tour. According to the band's public statement and tour reporting, the 2023 run was billed as the group's last full tour, spanning 29 shows from May through July. It was the 10th and final tour for Dead & Company. It also marked the first full tour without Bill, with Jay Lane stepping in after what the band described as a shift in creative direction. While framed as the final tour, it also turned out not to mean the end of the project in the absolute sense. Even during 2023, the subtext around the band was that it might stop touring without necessarily stopping altogether. This distinction became crucial almost immediately. In 2024, Dead & Company began Dead Forever, live at the Sphere in Las Vegas. Official materials describe the first run as a 30-show residency, and the project was significantly far more than just its scale. It placed Dead & Company inside one of the most technologically advanced concert venues in the world and gave the music a new visual language, immersive, cinematic, and built around large-scale environmental storytelling. Then the residency returned in 2025 for an 18-show second run again at the Sphere, this time tied to the band's 10-year anniversary. Sphere's official site shows that the 2025 shows followed the success of the first residency and featured updated visuals representing the latest chapter of Dead & Company's musical and experimental journey. By that point, the residency had grown to 48 total shows across 2024 and 2025. That is a huge historical marker because it shows the post-Jerry legacy not merely surviving but thriving in a completely different concert era. Then the story changed again in October 2024 when Phil Lesh died at 84. The official statement posted to Phil's social media said that he passed peacefully and was surrounded by his family and full of love. Phil's death was enormous because he was not just a founding member, he was one of the main architects of what made the Grateful Dead music harmonically and structurally different from almost every other rock band. If Jerry had been the spiritual center, Phil was one of the deepest musical engines. Even after Phil's death, the music kept moving. In August 2025, Dead & Company played 3 concerts in Golden Gate Park, billed as the celebration of 60 years of Grateful Dead music. The official Dead & Company site framed the event exactly that way, and it was another reminder that by this point, the music itself had become the organizing principle, not one fixed band, but a continuing body of songs, symbols, and community memory. Then came another moment that fundamentally changed the landscape. On January 10th, 2026, Bob Weir died at age 78. Bob's official website announced his passing, saying he died peacefully, surrounded by loved ones after beating cancer, but ultimately succumbed to the underlying lung issues. This was an enormous rupture because Bob had become one of the most visible and sustained bridges between the Grateful Dead and its post-Jerry future. Through Rat Dog, The Other Ones, The Dead, Furthur, Fare Thee Well, Wolf Bros, and especially Dead & Company. If Jerry's death ended the Grateful Dead, Bob's death changed the center of the post-Jerry universe. For decades, Bob had been one of the clearest living links to the original band's stage presence and cultural identity. With Phil gone in 2024 and Bob gone in 2026, the post-Jerry story suddenly looked very different. The legacy was still alive, but 2 of the biggest living anchors were now part of its history rather than the present. And that leaves the question that this whole story has been moving towards. Who carries the legacy forward now? The answer is not one person and probably never can be. Mickey is still a living founder. Bill remains part of the historical core even when not active in every project. John, Jeff, O'Till, and Jay Lane become essential carriers of the music through Dead & Company. Beyond them, bands like Joe Russo's Almost Dead, Billy and the Kids, and other Dead-adjacent ensembles have already shown that the songbook can survive outside any one fixed lineup. That may be the most Grateful Dead ending possible. Not one final successor, not one official replacement, but a whole web of musicians, scenes, and audiences continuing to find life in the songs. The Grateful Dead ended with Jerry. Phil and Bob are now gone too, but the music keeps moving through the remaining members, through the later collaborators, and through every band that still finds new space inside Eyes of the World, Dark Star, Scarlet Begonias, Terrapin Station, and all the rest. So the history of the Grateful Dead after Jerry is really the history of a legacy learning how to live without its center, and then learning how to live without more of its founding voices as time went on. The Grateful Dead ended in 1995. That should stay clear, but the songs did not end. They survived through Rat Dog, Phil Lesh and Friends, The Other Ones, The Dead, Furthur, Billy and the Kids, Fare Thee Well, Dead & Company, the Sphere residencies, the Golden Gate Park 60th anniversary shows, and a whole wider universe of musicians and fans who refuse to let the music die. And that may be the deepest truth of the entire post-Jerry era. No one can replace the Grateful Dead because no one can. But generation after generation kept finding ways to carry it forward. So don't forget to subscribe because I still have so many Grateful Dead stories and history to share. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Shakedown Relics for more Grateful Dead and Jam Band history.